She had polished silver in silence for 3 years, moving like a shadow through the marble halls of a billionaire's estate, unseen, unspoken to, and easily forgotten. But when Charles Whitmore, the most mysterious man in the city, suddenly asked her to be his guest at the grandest gala of the year, everything changed. The dress, the stairs, the power she never knew she carried. And as she stood under the chandelier, facing the very people who had always looked past her, the entire room stopped breathing. But what happened next? No one could have imagined. If this story touches your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, from where are you listening to this story? Your support keeps this voice alive. Perched high above the fog-draped hills of Vermont stood the Whitmore estate, a mansion so imposing it seemed to exist outside of time. Its iron gates, perpetually shut, gave the impression that no one ever entered, and perhaps more chillingly that no one ever left. The locals called it the House of Echoes. Whispers of its owner drifted through town like campfire tales. Billionaire, recluse, ghost. His name was Charles Whitmore, and for over a decade he had lived there without scandal, without spectacle, just shadows and silence. Inside those grand walls, life unfolded in whispers. And at the very bottom of the household hierarchy moved a girl the world had forgotten, Sarah Collins. She didn't belong in a place like that, or so she told herself every single morning. At just 23, Sarah had learned to exist without taking up space. She moved through corridors like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished marble. Her world was an endless loop of polishing silver until it gleamed like starlight, brushing ancient drapes that smelled of lavender and dust, and folding napkins with precision so sharp it could cut through glass. No one looked at her. Not really. She was the girl downstairs, the one who ate after everyone else had left the room, who slept in the attic room with the slanted ceiling, who read books in secret with a flashlight under her blanket when sleep wouldn't come. Her hair was always tied back in a bun so tight it made her head ache, her nails always short and clean, her voice always soft enough not to offend the air. Her story didn't begin at the mansion. It began in Portland, in a forgotten orphanage, where silence was survival and hope came in the form of a donated book. Her favorite, The Little Prince. She used to whisper its lines to herself like prayers. She still did sometimes. In the Whitmore household, no one asked about your past. They only expected obedience, and Sarah obeyed. She had worked there for 3 years without ever exchanging more than 10 words with the master of the house. Charles Whitmore was a figure glimpsed in passing, a tall man in tailored suits, with silver at his temples and eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. He never raised his voice, but when he entered a room, it fell silent by instinct. He was legend and mystery, flesh and fog. Sarah had learned the rules quickly. Never speak unless spoken to. Never look directly at Mr. Whitmore, never ask questions, and so she scrubbed and cleaned and folded day after day, letting time swallow her whole. Until one morning shattered the rhythm like glass against stone. It was a Tuesday, grey and cold with clouds sagging low and heavy over the hills. Sarah was kneeling in the west parlour, her hands deep in a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing the legs of the grand piano. Her knees ached against the stone floor. She was lost in thought, humming softly to herself, something forgotten from childhood, when she felt a presence behind her. She froze. Then she heard it. Sarah. The voice was deep, measured, and unmistakable. She turned so quickly she almost lost balance. Her eyes met his for the first time, truly met them, and something in her chest shifted. He wasn't angry or impatient, just focused. "Yes, sir." He didn't blink. "Tomorrow evening," he said slowly, each word like a stone dropped into water. "You will accompany me to the Whitmore Foundation Gala." She blinked, stunned. For a moment, she was certain she'd misheard. I don't understand." But Charles Whitmore never repeated himself. He simply turned and walked away. Sarah remained kneeling on the floor, her hands dripping soap, her heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears. She looked around, as if the furniture might confirm this wasn't some elaborate joke. But no one laughed. That afternoon, the head maid, Denise, handed her a sealed envelope. "There's a fitting in an hour, go." "No one's explained?" "You were chosen," Denise said flatly. "Don't question it, just go." At the boutique downtown, Sarah was met with a tailor who didn't ask her size. He measured her silently, precisely, as if building a statue from flesh. Rolls of satin and silk were unfurled. Shoes were brought out in glass cases. Makeup artists whispered about her bone structure. Someone suggested a sapphire dress. Someone else insisted on navy. She just stood there, mute, a mannequin in her own life. That night, back in her small attic room, she stared at the ceiling and tried to breathe. Why her? She wasn't beautiful, not in the way the women at the galas were. She didn't have perfect teeth or a polished laugh. She had scars on her palms from childhood chores, a quiet sadness in her gaze, and a library of unread stories etched into her soul. She'd spent her whole life fading into the background. Why would someone like him suddenly pull her forward? Unless he needed something from her. A prop, a statement, a performance. Sarah had never been to a gala, but she knew what they looked like. She'd dusted enough magazines to memorize the scenes. Elegant gowns, champagne flutes, diamonds the size of marbles. She knew the names of the donors, the heirs, the wives with surgically frozen smiles. It was a world built on rules she'd never been taught, and now she was expected to walk into it, with him. What would people say? What would they think? Would they know? Would they see right through her? Or worse, would they not see her at all? The wind howled outside her window. She pressed her forehead against the glass and stared at the hill's edge. The town below twinkled with scattered lights, unaware of the storm rising within her. She didn't sleep that night, because something was happening, something impossible. And in less than 24 hours, the girl no one ever noticed would step into a world where everyone was watching. But would she survive it? Or would it destroy what little of her was left? The next morning arrived like a curtain being drawn too quickly, harsh light flooding a stage unprepared. The estate buzzed with an energy Sarah had never felt before. Footsteps echoed louder, doors opened faster, and voices carried down hallways where silence used to reign. And yet, no one dared speak to her about it. No one acknowledged that something had shifted, that she had shifted. It was as if the house itself knew something unspoken was about to unfold. Sarah awoke early, though she hadn't slept more than an hour. Her body moved out of habit, pulling her hair into a bun, folding the corners of her bedsheet, brushing off the invisible lint from her uniform. But there was no uniform. Denise had taken it the night before and left her with nothing but a silk robe and a note. "You will be dressed at 5 p.m. Do not leave your room before then." The instructions were final, not even a question mark. So she waited. The waiting was worse than the fear. She sat at the edge of her bed, tracing the floor tiles with her toes, listening to the occasional gust of wind tapping the window panes like restless fingers. Her thoughts spun in circles. Had Charles chosen her on a whim? As a message? As revenge? Had she somehow crossed a line she wasn't aware of? At precisely 5, there was a knock. 2 knocks, actually, soft but confident. She opened the door and found a woman standing there, dressed in sleek black, holding a garment bag as though it contained treasure. She introduced herself simply, "Celia. I've been sent by Mr. Whitmore." Celia moved like a painter approaching a canvas. Every gesture was intentional, every word measured. She didn't ask questions. She didn't compliment or critique. She simply worked. First, her hair, undone from its tight grip, cascading in soft waves around her shoulders. Then her face, subtle makeup that made Sarah's freckles bloom instead of disappear. And finally, the dress. It was folded in layers of velvet paper inside the bag, but the moment Celia lifted it into the light, Sarah stopped breathing. Midnight blue. Not navy, not black. Blue so deep it shimmered like stardust under candlelight. The bodice was fitted but not tight, with delicate off-the-shoulder straps and tiny silver beads sewn along the hem like whispers. The skirt flowed freely, weightless, as if it had been made from smoke and moonlight. It was a dress for someone who had been born to be seen. And Sarah? She had spent her whole life being invisible. She hesitated. "This is not me." Celia met her eyes in the mirror. It is tonight. The driver arrived at 6. Sarah was escorted through the back corridor, away from the staff's quarters, away from familiar silence, and toward the front doors of the mansion she had never been permitted to use. Gregory, the head butler, opened them without a word. For the first time he bowed. The car was long, black, and waiting at the base of the marble steps. Its doors opened like secrets, revealing Charles already seated inside, a vision of restraint in a charcoal suit, silver cufflinks catching the final rays of daylight. He looked at her, and for the briefest second, his expression softened, not into a smile, but into something far rarer, recognition. She slid into the seat beside him, her hands trembling against the fabric of her dress. "You look," he began, then stopped himself. "Ready," that was all he said. The ride was quiet, but not empty. She could feel his gaze occasionally flicker toward her, as if trying to solve a puzzle he himself had created. And Sarah? She stared at her reflection in the tinted window, wondering who that girl was. This version of herself dressed in elegance, riding beside a man who made kings feel small. They arrived at the Golden Swan Hotel just past sunset. From the outside, the building resembled a palace dipped in champagne. Glass walls, gold sconces, a sweeping staircase that seemed carved from clouds. It glittered with wealth, with lineage, with everything Sarah had never dared to touch. As the car pulled up to the entrance, a red carpet unfurled beneath them like a tongue of flame. Cameras flashed, voices called names she didn't know. And then, silence. Because when Charles stepped out and offered his hand to help her from the car, everyone turned. Everyone. Her heart thundered so loudly she thought it might shake the pearls on her neckline. "Don't look down," he said softly, offering her his arm. "Let them wonder." She took it. Not because she was brave, but because he made it feel safe. Together, they climbed the stairs. The chandelier above the ballroom entrance hung like a galaxy of glass, and the moment they passed beneath it, the whispers began. "Who is she? Is that the maid?" No, she must be someone. Look at her dress." "She's stunning, but familiar." Did he finally remarry? The ballroom itself was unreal. An expanse of marble and music, string instruments swelling like breath, candles glowing in mirrored walls, and guests adorned in designer gowns and old money lineage. But Sarah didn't hear any of it. She was too aware of her steps, her breath, the sensation of her fingers gripping his arm like a lifeline. Every move felt like it echoed through time. Charles led her toward the center. And then, without warning, the music shifted. A waltz. He turned to her and extended his hand. "Dance with me. I don't know how. You will." And somehow, she did. His hand guided her lower back. Their palms touched, like it was fate itself pulling the strings. Around them, the ballroom faded. She couldn't hear the crowd, couldn't hear the questions, only the music, only him. People stared, people gasped. But Sarah moved like she had always belonged. The dress twirled around her like a comet. Her eyes found his with questions she couldn't speak, and he answered them with silence so profound it felt like truth. For 3 minutes, the world forgot her past. For 3 minutes, she was not a maid. She was myth. And when the dance ended, and applause rose like a wave, Charles bowed before her, not just politely, but with something that bordered on reverence. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Because the question had already been asked in every glance, every whisper. Who is she? And Sarah, though she hadn't spoken a word all evening, answered just by standing tall. Someone you'll remember. They hadn't stopped watching her. From the moment Sarah stepped off the dance floor, all eyes remained fixed. Not on Charles, not on the orchestra, not even on the glittering walls of the Golden Swan, but on her. As if some hidden magnetism had been released into the air, drawing curiosity, envy, and disbelief like moths to flame. And she felt it. The weight of 100 unspoken questions pressing down on her spine. But what surprised Sarah most was that she didn't shrink. She stood there, tall, still catching her breath from the dance, the midnight blue gown floating around her like water. Her cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but with something else. something that tasted suspiciously like power. She glanced around, and for the first time in her life, people looked away first. She was no longer the shadow in the corner. She was the room's center of gravity. "Would you like something to drink?" Charles asked beside her, his voice calm but low just for her. She nodded, still stunned. "Yes." "Water." He gave her a small smile, almost invisible yet enough to warm her shoulders, and stepped away. Alone now, Sarah was instantly surrounded by whispers. She could feel their edges like cold lace brushing her skin. Who is she really? Definitely European. Look at her cheekbones. Maybe an actress. No. I heard he brought her from Italy. Some hidden heiress. Sarah didn't speak, didn't smile. She simply walked, slowly, deliberately, toward the edge of the ballroom, each step rehearsed only in instinct. Every gaze that followed her, every breath held by someone trying to place her, only added to the tension that swirled in the room like perfume. And yet beneath the awe, there was disbelief. Because for those who had known Charles Whitmore, even peripherally, he had never brought a woman here, not once, not in a decade. And now, out of nowhere, he arrives not just with a date, but with her. Murmurs swelled like tides crashing against a castle wall. In a far corner, an older woman in emerald silk adjusted her diamond necklace and narrowed her eyes. "It's a stunt," she whispered. "Some twisted social commentary. Charles always had that streak in him." "No," another guest replied. "I saw the way he looked at her. That's not a statement. That's something else." But no theory could hold. Not when Sarah turned and without flinching met their gazes. Not when she tilted her chin ever so slightly. Just enough to challenge. Just enough to say, "I see you too." She wasn't playing a part. She was becoming someone else entirely. Then Charles returned. With water in one hand and champagne in the other, he handed her the glass without ceremony. No performance, no pretense. As if this had always been her place beside him. "They're still staring," she murmured, her voice barely audible beneath the cello's hum. "They will," he said, "because they don't understand you. Do you?" "I don't need to." He sipped his drink, eyes never leaving hers. "I see you." And suddenly all the air rushed from her lungs, not because of his words, but because she believed him. Before she could reply, the crowd shifted again. Someone important had entered, the kind of important that causes glasses to lower mid-toast and spines to straighten. Sarah followed their gaze. Margaret Lancaster. She'd only seen photos of her in magazines, a regal woman with ocean-grey eyes, hair always coiffed in classic waves, and a face that had graced every society page for 20 years. A woman known not just for her wealth, but for her sharpness. She was once rumored to have broken up an oil merger with a single dinner party. And she was Charles's former flame. Of course she was. Margaret approached like a queen surveying an unfamiliar piece on her chessboard. Her dress was impeccable, a blood-red sheath that clung to her like pride, and she carried a glass of brandy as if it were a weapon. "Charles," she said, pausing just close enough to be invasive. "Always a pleasure." His nod was polite, controlled. "Margaret." Her eyes shifted to Sarah. The silence that followed was not accidental. "And this," Margaret continued, "must be your companion." There was no smile, no warmth. Sarah felt the words slice toward her like ice. But before she could respond, Charles spoke first. In every sense that matters. The hush that rippled through the people around them was so precise, it could have been orchestrated. Margaret blinked just once, but it was enough to reveal the crack beneath the porcelain. "Well," she said, voice tight, "I must say she's surprising." Charles didn't blink. Unexpected doesn't mean unworthy. The statement hovered in the air, heavier than chandeliers. Margaret smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Of course. Enjoy your evening." With that, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, her heels clicking like daggers against the floor. Sarah exhaled. "That was brutal," she whispered. Charles merely raised an eyebrow. "You stood your ground. That's all that matters." And suddenly, Sarah understood something. This night wasn't just about appearance. It was a test, and she had passed the first part. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because while the elite admired mystery, They despised intrusion. And Sarah wasn't merely a guest now. She was a disruption, an anomaly, a mirror reflecting truths they didn't want to see. And mirrors, Sarah knew, were often the first things to be shattered. Still, she didn't leave. She walked beside Charles as he introduced her to politicians, philanthropists, and billionaires. He never introduced her as assistant or friend or date. He simply said, "This is Sarah," as if her name was enough, as if it was meant to be spoken among crystal and chandeliers. Some smiled with curiosity, others with calculation, but none could look away. And as she stood in the middle of the grand ballroom, her hand brushing the fabric of the dress that no longer felt like a costume, Sarah realized something. She wasn't pretending anymore. She had been changed, not by the dress or the makeup or even Charles' presence, but by choice. Her choice to show up, to take space, to be seen. But deep down, she knew this night held more than admiration or intrigue. It held something darker, and it was coming. As the night unfolded, the buzz in the ballroom grew more electric, though not because of the speeches or the music or the scent of aged wine in crystal glasses. The real event, the one no one dared to name out loud, was the mystery draped in midnight blue standing beside Charles Whitmore, Sarah Collins. But to the elite, she had no name, no past, no pedigree, just presence. And that was enough to disturb the room's fragile balance. "She's too composed," murmured a banker's wife behind a jeweled fan. "Too graceful for someone unknown. I bet she's a European aristocrat in disguise." "Rubbish," whispered another, a tech mogul's daughter. "She's probably a muse, a painter's model or something poetic. Look at the way she moves, like she's been watched before." In a far corner, a journalist from the Manhattan Lens discreetly typed on her phone. Headline: "The enigmatic beauty at Charles Whitmore's side. Heiress or hoax?" Even the orchestra seemed to play differently now, slightly softer, as if the strings too were eavesdropping. The crowd's collective curiosity birthed dozens of theories, each more elaborate than the last. "She's a long-lost daughter of someone powerful." "No, she saved Charles's life in a foreign country, and this is how he's honoring her. She must be an actress under contract. This has marketing stunt written all over it." Sarah caught pieces of these conversations as she walked through the ballroom with Charles, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. She didn't flinch, didn't answer. Silence, she realized, was more powerful than denial. Let them invent stories. Let them try to contain her with labels they themselves didn't understand. At one point, a well-dressed man in his 60s approached her, leaning in just enough to be heard over the strings of the quartet. "I don't believe we've met. Are you in publishing?" "No," she said simply. "Ah, art, then. You have that kind of air." "Not that either." His eyes narrowed, intrigued. "Finance?" "I clean things," she replied, her tone neutral but precise. "Very well." And with that, she walked away. The man stood frozen, uncertain whether he'd just been insulted or enlightened. Meanwhile, Charles observed everything. He wasn't a man easily amused, but tonight, the corners of his mouth curled ever so slightly every time Sarah outmaneuvered another inquiry. There was pride there, but something deeper too. Admiration, maybe even gratitude. Near the back of the ballroom, Sarah stepped out onto the marble terrace. The night air was cooler than expected, carrying the scent of magnolias and distant rain. She exhaled slowly, letting her shoulders relax. Inside, she had to hold her body like armor. Out here, she could breathe, but she wasn't alone for long. Charles appeared behind her, footsteps silent. He joined her at the railing without a word, hands tucked into his coat pockets. They looked out over the city, its lights glittering like a million quiet hopes. "They talk a lot," she said at last, her voice quiet but steady. "They always have," he replied. "They just never had anyone worth talking about." She turned to face him. "Why did you bring me here, Charles?" "Really?" He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he studied the skyline as if it held his answer. "Because they needed to see what strength looks like when it doesn't wear a title." Her throat tightened. He turned to her then, his gaze unwavering. "You are not what they see. Inside you're made of steel, and tonight they need to feel that." She didn't reply. The words settled into her bones like warmth in winter. But before she could ask what he meant by they, the moment was interrupted. From behind them came the sharp click of heels and the unmistakable voice of Julia Davenport, daughter of a pharmaceutical tycoon, board member of 3 charities she didn't believe in, and owner of the sharpest tongue in the room. "There you are," she said, her smile as sweet as poison. "I've been searching for you all night." Charles's expression didn't change. "Julia?" Her eyes flicked to Sarah. "And you must be the reason half the donors are too distracted to focus on their own egos." Sarah gave her a polite smile. "I doubt I'm that powerful." "Oh, but you are. After all, it takes a special kind of woman to keep Charles Whitmore away from the stock exchange." Charles didn't move, but something in his eyes hardened. Julia stepped closer. "So tell me, where do you come from? Your silence is very curated." Sarah didn't blink. "Does it matter?" "To most of them? Yes. But to me?" Julia sipped her champagne. "It's delightful. You have no name, no past. That means we can make you anything. A myth, a scandal, a movement. How modern." Sarah tilted her head, voice still soft. "Or maybe you're just afraid." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Of what, darling?" "That I'm everything you pretend to be, but without needing your approval." For the first time, Julia's smile faltered, and in that exact moment Sarah realized something profound. Power wasn't given. It was taken, claimed, or in rare cases, revealed. Julia turned to Charles, her voice a bit too sharp now. "Careful, Charles. A woman like that could make you forget your place." He didn't respond. Julia left. But she didn't win. When Sarah turned to look at Charles again, he was already watching her. "What?" she asked, half embarrassed. He shook his head just once. "You belong," he said simply, "even if none of them know it yet." A silence fell between them, but it was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. Inside, the orchestra began another waltz, another dance, another round of facades swirling under chandeliers. But on that terrace, something else was beginning. Not a dance, not a rumor, a shift. Sarah was no longer the curiosity of the evening. She was becoming the center of something far greater. And as the wind moved through her hair and the voices behind her spun more stories she would never confirm, she felt the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could feel: certainty. Sarah had been warned in silence, not through words, but in glances, in the hush that settled when she walked past, in the way people parted the floor like waves around her, clearing a path not out of reverence, but out of calculation. Someone was coming, and Sarah could feel it before she saw her. The queen of the ballroom had arrived, not a title given but earned, through reputation, lineage, and an unspoken dominion over the upper echelons of Manhattan society. Margaret Lancaster. The name didn't just command respect, it demanded it. She was more than a former flame of Charles Whitmore. She was a power broker, a collector of secrets, a woman who could lift a charity auction to international headlines or reduce a rising name to ash with a single smile. And now she stood across the ballroom, her presence a tidal wave wrapped in crimson satin. Her eyes found Sarah almost immediately, not with surprise, not with confusion, but with precision. Margaret began to cross the room. Sarah didn't move. She could feel the eyes returning to her, those same hungry eyes from before, but now they weren't filled with curiosity. Now they were gleaming with anticipation, the way spectators lean forward when they sense the fight is about to begin. Charles was still beside her, his posture relaxed, but Sarah could tell. He felt it too. That charged, invisible line stretching between the woman approaching and the woman who refused to look away. Margaret reached them. "Charles," she said, her tone so perfectly balanced it could have been mistaken for warmth, if not for the cold that clung to every syllable. "Margaret," he replied, his voice polite but taut. She turned to Sarah with a smile made of diamonds and steel. "And this must be the talk of the night." Sarah met her gaze. Up close, Margaret was beautiful in the way that ancient cities are beautiful, impressive, deliberate, and entirely aware of their own legends. "I don't believe we've met," she continued, offering her hand. Sarah accepted it without hesitation. "We haven't." Margaret's grip was firm, calculated. "You carry yourself well." Unusual considering, well, everything. I suppose invisibility teaches balance, Sarah said, her tone calm. You learn to walk quietly through rooms filled with noise. A pause. Margaret's smile faltered, just enough to be noticed. Charles has always had a taste for mystery, she said, brushing a non-existent thread from her gown. But this is something else entirely. It is, Charles said, stepping in now, his voice a shade colder. Something better. Margaret's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. She wasn't used to being challenged, not publicly, and certainly not by Charles, with someone else beside him. I hope you know, Margaret said, now turning back to Sarah, this world isn't kind to outsiders. It's like a dance, beautiful, but brutal. One misstep and... You fall? Sarah interrupted softly. Margaret tilted her head. Exactly. Sarah nodded, her voice quiet but sure. Then maybe it's time someone rewrote the choreography. That silence returned. Heavy, watching, judging. And this time, Margaret didn't speak. She simply smiled again, tight, practiced, and drifted away, swallowed by a circle of donors who immediately closed around her like loyal hounds returning to their master. Sarah exhaled slowly. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart was. Charles leaned closer. You didn't flinch. I did, she whispered. Just not where they could see. He let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh or a warning. Margaret doesn't forget, and she doesn't lose. I'm not trying to win, Sarah said. I'm trying to exist. And yet even as she spoke, she realized it wasn't true. She was trying to win, because something inside her had shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. That girl from the servants' wing, the one who moved through the mansion like smoke, was still in her but no longer in charge. What replaced her wasn't arrogance, it was presence, and presence could not be faked. As the night wore on, the confrontation buzzed through the ballroom like a rumor wrapped in gold foil. Margaret's poise had cracked. The newcomer had not bowed. It was the kind of moment society remembered because it wasn't supposed to happen. Sarah walked through the crowd differently now, not just with elegance, but with knowledge. She had seen the Queen, stared directly into her eyes and refused to lower her own, but that didn't mean she felt safe. Margaret was watching. She would wait. And Sarah had no illusions. The true battle hadn't started yet. Later, near the terrace again, she stood beneath the arch of flowering vines, letting the breeze move through the strands of her hair, now loosened by the night. The music from the ballroom faded slightly behind her, replaced by the softer hum of city traffic far below. And then, a voice she hadn't heard in years. You're Sarah Collins, aren't you? She turned. An older man stood by the column, holding a tray of flutes. His tuxedo faded around the edges, but clean. He wore a name tag, Joseph. His face was familiar, vaguely. I am, she said cautiously. He smiled, and in his eyes there was no judgment, only recognition. Portland Orphanage. I was the kitchen supervisor there for 13 years. Sarah blinked. Her hand went to her chest instinctively. I used to sneak you extra apple slices, he continued. You always sat by the window with a book. The Little Prince. You read it 5 times. A memory returned, soft, warm, unexpected. You remember me? She asked, voice almost breaking. I remember all the kids who didn't complain, he said gently. But you, Sarah, you had eyes like someone who already knew there was more out there, like the world hadn't fooled you yet. She swallowed hard. I didn't think anyone remembered. Some of us do, he said, glancing around. And tonight, we're proud. She smiled, touched his arm softly, and for a second, just a second, she wasn't at the gala, wasn't wearing a dress sewn by hand, or walking in shoes worth more than her childhood. She was just Sarah again, and that was enough. When she returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. She could feel it. The confrontation with Margaret had ignited something. People weren't whispering anymore. They were wondering, not just who she was, but why they hadn't noticed her before. And somewhere in the center of that growing storm stood Charles Whitmore, eyes scanning the crowd, always returning to her. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. Not once. And neither did she, because Sarah understood now. She had stepped onto a battlefield, but she had also begun to realize she might not be the underdog in this story anymore. The ballroom shimmered beneath the weight of murmurs, not just admiration now, but something colder, sharper, envy. Sarah could feel it, not in the open glances, but in the ones that looked away too quickly, not in the praise, but in the strained smiles, the compliments wrapped in thorned curiosity. She'd stepped into their world and shaken something loose, and envy, unlike curiosity, has teeth. She walked alone now, her fingers brushing the edge of a table lined with orchids. Charles had been called away briefly by one of the trustees, a matter of funding perhaps, or some elegant crisis only billionaires had the privilege to discuss. It was the first moment she was truly alone since arriving, and they took it. From across the room came Julia Davenport, not stalking like Margaret had, but floating, like a ghost with a purpose. Younger than Margaret, but no less lethal, Julia was the heiress to a pharmaceutical empire, raised on influence, accustomed to control. Her reputation wasn't forged through charm, but through the art of subtle corrosion. She didn't crush people, she dissolved them. "Beautiful dress," Julia said sweetly, approaching with a champagne flute in hand. "Stolen from the Whitmore archives, or is it custom humiliation?" Sarah turned, letting her gaze meet Julia's, calm, unshaken. "Neither," she replied softly, "but I can see how that might bother you." Julia laughed, genuinely, but cold. "Oh, you're clever. I like that. I just don't understand what game you think you're playing." "There's no game," Sarah said. "Not for me." "Darling," Julia said, stepping closer, her perfume sharp like white flowers under frost. "This is all a game. Every word, every glance, every dress. You think just because Charles brings you here in a custom gown you belong at the table? This world doesn't open doors, it lets you peek through them." Sarah didn't blink. "And yet, here I am." Julia's jaw tensed. "That won't last." "Maybe not," Sarah said, her voice low. "But tonight is mine, and that, Julia, is more than you can stand." The smile that flickered across Julia's lips was thin and brittle. "You know what the difference is between us?" she whispered, her breath just above Sarah's ear. "I was raised to be watched. You were raised to be invisible. And no matter what you wear, people like me will always see through the fabric." Sarah's eyes softened, not with defeat, but with something else. Pity. "You're right," she said. "You see through fabric, I see through people." Julia pulled back, blinking once. Sarah's voice dropped even lower. "That's why you're afraid of me." Julia tried to laugh again, but the sound caught. For the first time that night, she was the one who turned and walked away. Sarah remained still, her breath steady, though her heart thudded in her chest like distant thunder. It wasn't triumph she felt. It wasn't power. It was something quieter, something steadier. Victory, the first of its kind. Not because she had humiliated Julia, but because she hadn't needed to. She had let the truth speak for itself. A moment later, Charles returned. "You handled her well," he said simply, offering his arm. "You saw?" He gave a soft nod. "Every word." Sarah hesitated before asking, "Why did you bring me into this?" He looked at her, not as an accessory, not as a guest, but as an equal. "Because I've walked through these halls alone long enough," he said. "And because they needed to see what real strength looks like." She didn't respond, but her fingers slipped around his arm, and they walked on, through the echoing laughter, the tinkling glasses, and the music that never quite masked the sound of shifting alliances. As they passed a group of donors near the art wall, Sarah overheard a whisper. "She's not what I expected." "Neither was the Mona Lisa," someone else murmured. She smiled to herself. This world was built on expectation, and she was becoming its exception. The night wore on, speeches, toasts, awards, but the real ceremony was in the quiet moments, the way people began approaching her differently, not as a curiosity, but as a possibility. One woman, Elizabeth Monroe, founder of a national education fund, took Sarah's hand with eyes that gleamed with recognition. "You've started something tonight," she said, "and I don't think you understand yet how far it will reach." Sarah only nodded, still unsure what that truly meant. After all, she hadn't planned for any of this. She had been cleaning brass candle holders just yesterday, and now people were looking at her the way she used to look at portraits, searching for meaning in silence. Later, she excused herself and slipped toward the side corridor where a velvet curtain marked the entrance to a quieter lounge. She needed air, or stillness, or both. The room was dim, lit only by wall sconces. It smelled of cedar and old books, and sitting at the far end of a long leather couch was a man who looked out of place, not in his attire, which was perfect, but in his posture, which was not. He slouched, hands clasped, as if he were shrinking inside his own suit. He looked up when she entered. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not," he replied. "I was hoping someone real might walk in." She tilted her head, curious. "And I look real." He smiled faintly. "You look tired of pretending." She stepped closer. "Are you?" "Always," he admitted. There was something about him, something unfinished. He introduced himself as Daniel, an architect from Chicago, visiting on behalf of a firm. But that wasn't what stuck with her. It was the way he watched the room from its edges, like her. They talked for only 5 minutes, but it was enough. Not for flirtation, not for anything dramatic. Just, understanding. A mirror held up in an unexpected moment. Before she left the lounge, Daniel said something that lingered in her mind even as she rejoined the noise of the ballroom. "People forget," he said, "that the quiet ones see everything. And sometimes, they're the ones who rebuild what others ruin." She didn't respond, but she carried the words with her. Outside, the gala was beginning to wind down. People were loosening ties, removing heels, letting their masks crack just enough to reveal fatigue beneath the sparkle. But Sarah? She stood straighter, because she could feel it under her skin, beneath the satin and silver, past the gaze of Margaret or the jealousy of Julia. A shift, subtle but seismic. Tonight had not broken her, it had shown her. And for the first time in her life, Sarah Collins began to wonder, what if this was only the beginning? The ballroom had quieted, not in volume, but in tone. The evening was moving into its second act, when the lights grew softer, the music slower, and the truth behind the champagne smiles began to flicker through. Guests were settling into comfort, masks slipping just enough to reveal hints of exhaustion, or boredom, or ambition that hadn't yet been satisfied. Sarah walked along the edges now, her presence still felt, still noticed, but no longer questioned. She had earned, somehow, the right to remain standing. But then, a voice called her name. Soft, aged, familiar in a way that unsettled her completely. Sarah Collins. She turned, expecting some harmless donor or well-dressed guest, looking to indulge in more polite curiosity. But instead, she found herself staring into the face of a man with silver eyebrows, sun-creased skin, and eyes that sparkled with memory. He wasn't a guest. He wore a black vest, a crisp white shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and he held an empty tray against his hip. A waiter, a staff member, just like she used to be. She blinked, surprised. "Yes." A smile bloomed across his face. "You probably don't remember me, but I used to work at the Portland Children's Shelter. I was the night shift kitchen manager. My name's Henry." She stared at him, and then, suddenly, she was 9 years old again, sitting on a cracked cafeteria bench, watching him carry a crate of apples into the pantry. Her heart squeezed. "You gave me extra cinnamon when I helped stack the trays," she whispered, the memory blooming like a wildflower. He laughed. "You always read during dinner. You'd tuck the book under your tray like you were hiding gold." She couldn't help but smile, eyes misting. "I remember now. Didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said, stepping a little closer. "But when I passed you earlier tonight, I said to myself, that's little Sarah from Portland. Can't be anyone else. Not with those eyes." She looked down for a moment, swallowing hard. No one in this place knew that part of her. No one had spoken her name like it belonged to a child in years. And yet here he was, someone from before the marble floors, before Charles Whitmore, before midnight gowns and polished lies. "I didn't think anyone remembered," she murmured. "I remembered," he said simply. "You were always quiet." But you saw things. The other kids liked noise, liked fighting. You liked silence. Pages. Stars. Her throat ached. I used to think no one saw me at all, she admitted. That's how I knew you were special, he said, his voice soft. You didn't need to be seen to be important. The words landed deep, too deep. She touched his arm gently, grounding herself. Thank you, Henry, for saying that, for remembering. He smiled. I'd recognize your fire anywhere. And with that, he gave her a respectful nod and disappeared into the crowd of servers, back to his duties, leaving her standing there, quietly undone. She moved toward the side of the ballroom, finding a marble pillar to lean against, her hands trembling softly. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pressure, it was recognition, from someone who had known her when she had nothing to offer. No mask, no presence, just survival. And in that moment, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe until now. She hadn't just been chosen tonight. She had earned this. Every scar, every silence, every forgotten moment had led her here. A soft voice beside her broke the reflection. You okay? Charles. She turned to him, startled, then nodded slowly. Yes, just someone remembered me. From before. He tilted his head. Before the estate. Before everything, she said. The shelter, Portland. Something flickered in his expression. Not surprise, understanding. They never really forget us, he said. They just stop looking. She studied him. Did they forget you too? He hesitated, and for a heartbeat, he looked younger, like the boy he once was. I used to sleep on church steps in Boston, he said, voice low. When I was 16, I would fake my name, sneak into hotel lobbies just to steal a piece of warmth. One night, I crashed a gala like this one. Someone left the service door open. I wore a suit I'd borrowed from a donation bin. I stood in the corner with a glass of sparkling water and pretended to belong. She was silent, wide-eyed. No one noticed me, he continued. Not one person. I told myself that if I ever got the chance to walk back into a room like that, I'd bring someone with me. Someone they wouldn't expect. Someone they'd never dare to ignore. Sarah's chest felt tight. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Why me? She asked quietly. Out of everyone? He looked at her, not like a billionaire, not like a man trying to impress, just a man who had once been invisible. Because I know what it's like, he said, to have the world look past you, and because you remind me what it means to fight without ever raising your voice. She didn't reply. Couldn't. She just nodded once, her eyes shimmering, her breath caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. And then something unexpected happened. Charles stepped closer and whispered, They're going to ask questions about you tomorrow. They'll dig, they'll speculate. I know, she said. And what will you say? Sarah turned to face the ballroom, the music, the chandeliers, the faces. I won't say anything, she replied. Let them wonder. A beat passed. Then he smiled, and for the first time all night, it reached his eyes. From the far end of the ballroom, a photographer raised a camera. Someone important had arrived. Her fresh distraction, a shift in focus. But Charles didn't look away, and neither did she. Because this time Sarah wasn't drifting on borrowed grace. She was rooted in memory, seen by someone from her past, and recognized by the man beside her, not for who she pretended to be, but for who she had always been. Still deep within her, an unspoken truth began to rise. If people had forgotten where she came from, she would remind them, not in words, but in presence, and they wouldn't forget her again. By now, Sarah was no longer a mystery. She had become something more dangerous to the room, a symbol. People weren't whispering her name out of curiosity anymore. They were measuring her, watching how others looked at her, taking note of who gravitated toward her and who kept their distance. In a world built on legacy, her presence stirred unease, not because she didn't belong, but because she challenged the idea of what it meant to belong at all. She was seated now, briefly, in a small velvet alcove near the main gallery, sipping still water from a delicate glass, her body trying to recover from hours of being seen. Her feet ached inside heels she hadn't chosen, her back straight not by command, but by habit, because slouching felt like surrender, and she couldn't afford surrender tonight. A man approached her with a practiced smile and a too-white pocket square. "Excuse me," he said, not really waiting for her permission to speak. "I write for the Financial Herald. May I ask you a few questions?" Sarah blinked slowly. "You just did." He chuckled, missing the point. "We're all a bit curious. No one knew who you were a week ago, and tonight, well, you're the most talked-about woman in the room." She didn't respond. "So," he pressed, voice light but insistent, "is this part of a campaign? A philanthropic narrative? A shift in the Foundation's branding?" Her eyes met his, calm, measured. "I'm here," she said, "because someone chose to open a door that most people spend their lives pretending doesn't exist." He hesitated, caught off guard by the sharpness behind her quiet tone. "And what do you do, Miss Collins?" "I used to polish brass until it shone so brightly people could see themselves in it," she said. "Now I suppose I let them see me." The reporter blinked. He tried to formulate a follow-up, but she was already rising to her feet. Behind her, the weight of the ballroom shifted again. Elsewhere, near the grand piano beneath the mezzanine, Charles stood in conversation with two governors, a Nobel Prize winner, and the CEO of a global charity. But his attention, though politely masked, was not on their words. His eyes flicked across the room until they found her again, standing tall, standing alone. "Excuse me," he said simply, and the circle parted. He met Sarah halfway, his hand slipping lightly to the small of her back. "Too much?" he asked almost gently. "Too clear," she said. "They want mystery. They don't know what to do with clarity." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "They'll try to rewrite the story tomorrow," he warned. She didn't flinch. "Let them. I've lived enough stories written by other people." He studied her for a moment. "You're not afraid anymore." "I am," she said. "But I'm standing anyway." That made something in him shift. Respect, yes. But also relief. As they moved together toward the gallery corridor, lined with paintings from the Whitmore Foundation's private collection, Sarah glanced around and said, almost under her breath, "I still don't understand why you chose me." He stopped walking. The hallway was quieter here. The music distant, the guests just echoes behind thick walls. Charles turned to her. His voice was even, but stripped of its usual restraint. "You were never supposed to be invisible, Sarah, but you learned how to survive that way. I saw that." She frowned. "When?" "The first time I saw you," he said. "You were wiping down the piano bench. You paused to run your fingers across the keys, not to play, just to feel. You weren't cleaning anymore. You were remembering something, something that hurt." She felt her breath catch. He went on. "Most people walk through this world reacting. You didn't. You listened, observed, adapted. You became what the world allowed, but you never stopped carrying the part of you that wanted more." A silence bloomed between them, not awkward, not uncomfortable, just real. Then he said, "I didn't choose you tonight." She looked up, startled. "I chose you months ago," he continued. "I just waited for you to choose yourself." She swallowed hard. "So this was a test?" "No," he said. "It was a door, and you walked through it." Her hands tightened around the edges of her clutch. "I feel like I've lived 1,000 lives since I stepped into this dress," she whispered. He nodded. "And none of them were pretend." She turned to the wall beside them, where a single painting hung, a woman in profile, her hair tied back, her hands folded over a book. The plaque beneath read, "Elena Whitmore, 1923, The Quiet Revolution." "She reminds me of you," Charles said. Sarah looked at him. "Who was she?" "My grandmother," he answered. "She wasn't born into this. She married into it, and she never let it change her. She used to say, 'The ones who whisper can still move mountains, they just do it without an audience.'" Sarah's throat tightened, and then she asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of her mind for hours. "Why now, Charles? Why tonight?" He hesitated and then said, "Because I needed to remind myself what courage looks like, and I wanted them to see it too." She looked at him, really looked at him. the man who owned islands, the man who never raised his voice, the man who had once faked his way into a gala just to belong, and now he was bringing someone in from the shadows. Because once he had lived there too. She took a breath, then another. And then she said, "I don't know where this is going." He offered a small smile. "Neither do I, that's the point." Behind them, the sound of heels approached quickly. The reporter again. "Mr. Whitmore," he called. "Forgive the interruption. I was just wondering. Tonight's appearance with Miss Collins, is it a statement?" Charles turned slowly, calmly, and said, "Yes." The reporter blinked. "To say what, exactly?" He looked at Sarah, then back at the man holding the pen. "That not every voice comes from a stage," Charles said. "Some start in silence, and that silence deserves to be heard." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he offered Sarah his arm once more. She took it, and as they walked back toward the heart of the gala, the chandelier above them glittered brighter than before, casting reflections across every face in the room. Sarah walked taller now. Not because she was pretending to be someone else, but because, for the first time, she had stopped pretending she wasn't already enough. Still, as they re-entered the light and applause began for the night's keynote speaker, one thought echoed in her mind. If this was just the beginning of her voice being heard, what would she say next? The ballroom had entered that strange golden hour when everything softened. Lights dimmed, voices mellowed, and the intensity of the evening gave way to something more vulnerable. People began unbuttoning jackets, abandoning posture, revealing their real faces beneath layers of elegance, and Sarah, still standing in midnight blue, remained at the center of it all. But something had changed. They weren't staring anymore. Not the same way. Now they were approaching her. It began with a woman in emerald satin, her posture elegant, her eyes tired, but warm. She stepped forward without hesitation, a sense of purpose in every move. "Miss Collins," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Elizabeth Monroe. I run a non-profit for youth education across New England." Sarah took her hand, unsure if this was another test, but Elizabeth smiled. "I've been watching you all night, and I have to say, you've done more in one evening than I've seen some public figures manage in a decade." Sarah blinked. "I haven't done anything." Elizabeth laughed gently. "Exactly. And yet, here we are, talking about you." Sarah said nothing, unsure whether to accept or deflect. But Elizabeth's tone softened. "I grew up in a trailer in Maine. My parents worked 3 jobs between them. No one invited me to anything for a long time, until I started creating my own table. You remind me of the version of myself I had to fight to protect." Sarah's eyes shimmered. Elizabeth continued, "We have a mentorship program for young girls in transitional housing. I think they need to see someone like you. Would you consider speaking to them?" Sarah hesitated. Public speaking. She had barely spoken to herself in a mirror. "I don't know if I'm qualified." "You're not," Elizabeth said bluntly. "That's why it'll matter more." They held each other's gaze in silence, and Sarah nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." Elizabeth smiled. "That's all I ask." As she left, another figure emerged, this time a man with salt and pepper hair and a press badge tucked into his breast pocket. He didn't hold a notepad, just his phone. "Miss Collins," he said politely, "I'm the senior editor at Legacy magazine. I don't do gossip, I do long-form stories, profiles, transformations. I'd like to interview you, possibly feature you on the cover." Sarah blinked. "The cover?" "Yes," he replied. "You're the talk of the city. But the thing is, no one really knows you yet, and the world's hungry for stories like yours, ones that don't come from celebrity, but from something real." She didn't answer right away. Her silence he seemed to understand. "You don't need to decide now," he said, handing her a card. "But if you're ready to tell the world where you came from, on your own terms, we'll listen." And just like that, he too disappeared into the sea of velvet and gold. Sarah stood still. Everything in her was trembling, not with fear, but with choice. People were no longer reacting to her presence. They were offering her a future, a shape, a direction, and she wasn't sure she was ready for any of it. Charles approached again, noticing the flush on her face. Overwhelming. She looked at him. They're offering me things I never imagined. He nodded. They will. Because now you've made them look at something they were trained to ignore. But what if I say yes and fail? Then you'll learn, he said. But if you say no, the silence might swallow you again. She looked away, her throat tight. He added, what you do from here, that's the real statement, not the dress, not the ballroom. She nodded slowly. Just then another woman approached. Younger, late 20s, eyes wide with emotion. She looked nervous, like she wasn't supposed to be there. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I had to come say something. Sarah turned to her gently. It's okay, what is it? My name is Mia, she said. I'm one of the interns from the catering staff. I watched you tonight, and I just wanted to say thank you for showing me it's possible. Sarah's breath caught. Mia wasn't part of the gala. She was part of the world Sarah had come from. She touched the girl's hand. You saw me? Mia nodded. I'm still invisible, but you reminded me that maybe that's not forever. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. It's not. Mia smiled, tears threatening, then backed away quickly, blending into the shadows once more. But the moment remained, heavy, sacred. Sarah turned back toward the crowd and realized this wasn't about one night anymore. It wasn't about elegance or approval or who Charles was. It was about what she would do with the attention she never asked for, but now had. She walked toward the far window, where the city stretched endlessly below. From there, everything looked possible, everything looked small. And then she heard it again. A whisper. Not from others, but from within herself. You're not here by accident. You've always been meant for more. She let the words settle. Let them warm the parts of her still afraid. And then, as if fate were listening, Charles stepped beside her. They're going to keep coming, he said. The requests, the noise, the pressure. She nodded. But I have an idea, he added. She turned. What kind of idea? A project, he said. Your project. A space for stories like yours. Girls like you. Maybe even boys like I used to be. She stared at him. A foundation? A movement, he said, if you want it. Sarah didn't speak. Not yet. Her heart was too full. But in her chest, something had already begun to form. A vision of a room where no one was invisible, where voices weren't given but uncovered. I'll think about it, she whispered again. But this time, she already knew her answer, because tonight had proven something that no dress or spotlight ever could. She didn't need to be chosen anymore. She was starting to choose herself. The night was almost over. The laughter had dulled to murmurs. Champagne flutes stood half-finished on tabletops, and the orchestra had shifted to softer, more melancholic arrangements. Most guests had said their goodbyes or found comfort in hushed conversations on velvet couches. The gala had given all it could, and yet Sarah remained. Not because she was trying to impress anyone now, but because something still held her there. A question that hadn't been asked, an answer that hadn't yet been offered. She stood near the tall glass doors of the ballroom's upper terrace, watching the city below shimmer like a sleeping beast. Its light breathing steady, unknowingly witnessing her transformation from afar. Charles approached quietly, carrying 2 small porcelain cups. Chamomile, he said, offering her one. I thought you could use something that doesn't come with bubbles or opinions. She smiled faintly, accepting it. Thank you. They sipped in silence. And for once it wasn't heavy. It was warm. Real. After a few minutes, Charles spoke. You asked me earlier, why tonight? She turned toward him, waiting. His voice was calm, but not cold. It carried the softness of memory. I used to stand exactly here, he said, stepping closer to the railing. When I was 21, it was the first time I was invited to an event like this, not as a guest. I came as an assistant to someone else, a powerful man. You wouldn't know his name. Doesn't matter. Sarah said nothing. I wore a suit 2 sizes too big, stood against that wall over there while they sipped their aged wine, and spoke about people as if they were numbers on paper. I smiled when appropriate. took notes when asked, stayed invisible, and when no one was looking, I came out here to this spot. He touched the cold stone railing. I stared out at the city, just like you're doing now, and I made myself a promise. What kind of promise? Sarah asked, voice low. That if I ever had the power to open a door, I'd open it for someone no one else would see coming. She felt her throat tighten. He continued, I built everything I have now from that night forward. Not out of rage, not even out of ambition, out of hunger. The hunger to be more than overlooked, the hunger to matter. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the weight in his eyes. Not the weight of money, but of history. And you, he said, reminded me of who I was before the suits fit and the invitations had my name embossed in gold. Sarah looked down, fingers curling around the porcelain cup. I don't know what to do with all of this, she admitted. Charles nodded. Neither did I, at first. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up in the attic and find the floor cold under my feet again. You might, he said. That fear doesn't go away. You just stop letting it lead. Silence. Then she asked the question she hadn't dared all night. Why did you disappear? Charles glanced toward the city again. Because being seen comes at a cost, he said. I rose too fast, took too much air out of rooms not built for me. I was praised, until I wasn't. And when you're no longer useful to them, they don't kill you, they erase you. Her breath caught. They turned on you. Not publicly, he said. They just stopped calling. Deals fell through. Invitations vanished. Suddenly I was too controversial, too private, too independent. And so you retreated, she said softly. He nodded. For a while I thought that was the cost of success, but now I know. It was the price of survival. I had to disappear in order to rebuild without noise. She looked at him, really looked, and what she saw wasn't a billionaire in tailored clothing. It was a man who had fought for every inch of space he stood in. You don't owe them anything, she said. I know, he replied, but I owe something to the person I was, and to the ones who are still there, still cleaning tables, still folding sheets, still waiting for someone to see them. The night air brushed her skin like silk. She thought of the girl she'd been, the one who read by flashlight, who flinched at voices raised too loud, who had learned to be useful, quiet, and invisible. And now she stood beside a man who had chosen her not as a token, but as a mirror. She finished her tea. So what now? She asked. Charles didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black envelope. She hesitated before taking it. Inside was a simple card. No logo, no letterhead, only a name. Voice from the shadows. Below it, a foundation for unseen potential. Her eyes widened. You created this? I started the paperwork this week, he said. But it won't mean anything without someone to lead it, someone who knows what silence feels like. She stared at him, stunned. Can you want me to run this? I want you to make it real, he said. Name it what you want, shape it. Build something that doesn't need chandeliers and orchestras to make people feel seen. She held the card in her hand like a flame. I don't know if I'm ready. Charles took a breath, then said something that struck her deeper than anything that night. You've already survived the part that most people never make it through. The rest is learning to walk with your head held high. She blinked quickly, fighting back the tears pressing against her chest. You believe in me more than I do, she said. No, he replied gently. I believe in the girl who used to polish brass and memorize poems and tuck books into her apron. I believe in the woman who walked into a ballroom where no one knew her name and left as someone they'll never forget. Sarah swallowed hard. For the first time, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like the architect of something real, something hers. She slipped the card into her clutch, then looked out over the city again. She didn't need the Gala anymore, didn't need their validation. What she needed now was courage, not to be seen, but to step forward. She turned back to Charles, and in her eyes was the beginning of a decision. But the final answer, that would come with the sunrise. The clink of glasses, the fading music, the rustle of designer gowns. It all dulled into background noise the moment the MC stepped back up to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice warm, practiced. Tonight has been more than a celebration. It's been a reminder. That legacy is not just inherited, it's built, and sometimes it rises from silence. There was a pause, a murmur. Tonight, we invite someone to speak who has shown us exactly that. The room turned, all at once as if drawn by instinct. And there she was, Sarah Collins, standing near the archway, her hands calm at her sides, her eyes scanning the sea of faces that, just hours ago, hadn't known her name. Charles stood just behind her. A quiet presence, not leading, not speaking, just watching. She walked to the stage, every step echoing slightly on the marble floor, each beat syncing with the shift in the room's collective breath. She didn't rush. She didn't smile performatively. She didn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. When she reached the podium, she paused, looked out, waited for the silence to settle fully. And then she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I've worked in this building for 3 years," she began, eyes calm, unwavering. "Many of you passed me in the hallways. Some of you may have handed me a tray or asked me to clean up a spill." A ripple moved through the room. "I used to move like a shadow," she said. "Not because I wanted to, but because it was safer that way. The less I existed, the less I risked being reminded that I didn't belong." Someone near the back shifted uncomfortably. "But tonight," her voice caught, just for a moment. She steadied herself. "Tonight I stood on this floor, in this dress, in your gaze, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't a shadow anymore." The ballroom was silent now, not out of politeness, but reverence. "I didn't come from privilege," she continued. "I came from a place where the world forgets you before you even learn to speak. I was raised in a shelter. I read library books while others played. I polished stair railings and folded linens and memorized how to disappear." Her hands gripped the podium now. "But even in that invisibility, I dreamed." A flicker passed through the crowd. "I dreamed that one day someone would hear my voice, not because I shouted, but because I had something to say." She glanced toward Charles just briefly. "And tonight, someone did." She turned back to the audience. "And I want to say something to anyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. Anyone who was told they weren't enough. Anyone who learned to shrink so others could shine." Her voice grew stronger. "You don't have to stay small." A murmur, a hand over a heart. "You don't have to wait for someone to give you permission to exist. Your voice matters, even if it shakes. Your presence matters, even if they don't understand it yet. And your story matters, especially if it hasn't been told." From somewhere in the middle of the room, a woman's eyes welled. Sarah leaned in slightly. "If a girl in an orphanage can stand here and speak to a room like this, imagine what could happen if we let more voices rise." She exhaled softly, then added one final sentence. "And if even one person walks out of here tonight, believing they can stand taller, then everything I've lived through was worth it." A pause. Then silence. Then applause, not polite, not staged. It started small, then grew. People stood, men in suits, women in heels, staff members near the kitchen doors. Even the orchestra rose, instruments set aside. Some clapped through tears, others through disbelief. But they all clapped, because something in her words had reached past the gowns, past the wine, past the politics of wealth. It had touched the human in them. Charles stepped forward, but didn't approach the stage. He stayed in the shadows near the side, watching her become everything he had always hoped she would. Sarah remained still for a moment, letting the applause roll over her like a wave. But inside, she wasn't drowning. She was standing. Finally. When she stepped down, people reached for her hands. Some wanted pictures. Others whispered, "Thank you," as if confessing secrets. But it was one woman, a cleaning staff member still in uniform, who held Sarah's hand with both of hers and said, "I've waited my whole life to hear someone like me speak from that stage." Sarah couldn't speak. She just nodded, eyes shimmering. Back in the quiet of the hallway, Charles joined her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just rewrote the night," he said. She looked at him. "No," she answered softly. "I just told the truth." He smiled. And for once, she smiled too. Not the polite smile, not the trained one, the real one. A minute later, her phone buzzed, silently in her clutch. Messages, hundreds. From people she didn't know, from others who remembered her, from women in shelters, from teachers in public schools, from girls sitting alone in their bedrooms, watching the live stream through cracked screens. You gave me hope. I felt seen for the first time. Please don't stop speaking. Sarah scrolled once, then twice, then stopped. She looked at Charles. What if I can't hold all of this? He held her gaze. You don't have to, he said. You just need to keep going. She nodded slowly, because deep down, she understood now. The speech had been more than a moment. It had been a spark, and fires, when born in truth, don't die easily. They spread. The morning after the gala, New York woke to a different kind of headline. It wasn't about a new merger. It wasn't about a scandal. It wasn't even about Charles Whitmore. It was about her. The maid who stole the gala. Voice from the shadows. The woman who made a room of billionaires listen. Sarah Collins. The speech heard across the nation. Photographs flooded the internet. Her standing alone on the stage, eyes bright but calm, her hands poised over the podium like she'd been born to speak truth to silence. But it wasn't just press. It was people. Thousands of comments, videos, messages, from social workers, from teachers, from survivors, from young women in group homes watching her speech on borrowed phones, whispering her name like it was a lighthouse in the dark. She didn't read all the messages, but the ones she did changed her. You told my story, even though we've never met. I thought no one could see me, but you made me feel seen. How do I find my voice too? And the most simple of all, thank you. That word alone arrived more than 10,000 times. And Sarah, who once thought she had nothing to offer the world but silence, now sat in the middle of something too vast to contain. She had become a symbol, but more importantly, she had become real. The Whitmore estate no longer felt distant or cold. The hallway where she used to scrub floors now echoed with purpose. The chandeliers no longer mocked her invisibility. The marble staircase didn't seem as tall. Even Denise, the stern headmaid, greeted her that morning with a hesitant smile and a folded newspaper in hand. You've stirred things up, she muttered, passing the front page like it was contraband. Sarah took it gently. Her own face looked back at her, poised, soft, determined. And for the first time, she didn't look away. Later that day, Charles met her in the garden. No suits, no formality, just him, a plain black sweater and a cup of black coffee. The man behind the myth. They're asking when you'll speak again, he said. Sarah raised an eyebrow. I haven't decided if I will. He studied her. Why not? Because I don't want to become someone else's symbol. I don't want to be put in a box. He nodded. Then build your own. She smiled faintly. That sounds like something you'd say. He leaned back. Maybe I'm learning from you. She paused, then said, I want to do it. The foundation. Voice from the shadows. But not for press, not for gala invitations. I want it to be real. Charles nodded. It will be, because it starts with truth. That afternoon, they announced it quietly. No press conference, no champagne. Just a post on the Foundation's website. Voice from the Shadows is an initiative dedicated to helping youth from shelters, foster care, and overlooked communities find strength through education, mentorship, and storytelling. At the bottom of the page, a simple quote from Sarah. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to be honest. Over the next few weeks, something incredible happened. Schools called, shelters called, influencers reshared her speech, documentary producers sent proposals. But Sarah didn't rush. She chose with care. She visited her old shelter in Portland, walking past peeling paint and quiet rooms that still remembered her footsteps. She spoke to the girls there, not with scripts, but with honesty. I used to sit right here, she said, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the reading room, and I'd close my eyes and pretend I was somewhere else. But what I didn't know then was that who I was here mattered just as much as who I'd become. A girl named Natalie asked her, "Did you ever think you'd be famous?" And Sarah answered, "I never wanted to be famous. I just didn't want to disappear." They understood that. She could see it in their eyes. In the weeks that followed, Voice from the Shadows launched its first mentorship group. 10 girls, 10 different stories. One common thread: all had been overlooked. Sarah didn't just fund it. She taught. She listened. She sat in rooms without cameras. She read their essays. She asked them questions no one else had. And in return, they told her things they had never spoken aloud. She realized that this was what mattered. Not the standing ovations. Not the magazine features. But the quiet moments in between. Where lives began to bend in a new direction. Where silence became strength. Charles remained involved, but always at a distance. He showed up at key moments, sat in the back of meetings, sent handwritten notes to the girls who shared their stories. One afternoon, Sarah found him in the library at the estate, staring at the same portrait he'd shown her the night of the gala, his grandmother, Elena Whitmore. "She'd be proud of you," he said. Sarah smiled gently. "She'd be proud of you." He shook his head. She was a woman of action. She didn't just open the door, she kicked it off its hinges. Sarah laughed softly. "Then I hope I've inherited something from her." He looked at her. "You've become more than I imagined." She paused. "Then you imagined too little." The press eventually moved on, as it always does. But the movement didn't stop. New letters arrived every day. New girls joined the program. And Sarah's voice, once tucked beneath layers of fear, became something steady, strong, unmistakable. She no longer walked like a shadow. She moved like someone who understood the weight of being seen. And with each step, she carved space for others to be seen too. A year later, a new gala was held. This time, Sarah didn't arrive beside Charles. She arrived alone, not in borrowed confidence, but in her own. She wore deep green, simple, powerful, unmistakable. And when she stepped onto the stage to speak again, the room didn't lean in with curiosity. It stood still with respect, because Sarah Collins was no longer a mystery. She was a voice, and she had only just begun. She entered the ballroom as a maid, silent, invisible, uncertain. But she left as something no one could ignore, a voice that rose from the shadows, not in anger, but in truth. Sarah didn't change to belong. She remembered who she was to transform what belonged to others. And in doing so, she gave light to those who had only ever known silence, because sometimes the loudest revolution begins in a whisper, and maybe this story was never just about her. Maybe it's also about us. If this story moved you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. From where are you listening to this story? Your presence helps us continue bringing voices like this to life.